Good morning, guys. Bart here, Canine Evolution. So I want to talk to you about some dog reactivity. There's a couple of posts going on the internet and Facebook about dog reactivity and that dogs hit their threshold. I have a kind of different but similar explanation for it that hopefully will make more sense. I have developed a canine psychological critical circle of confidence, and basically what that is the dog in relationship to his adjutant or stressor or trigger. You'll see the dog in the middle. You'll see in this particular picture a decoy or an agitator that causes pressure, and then you see circles: green, orange, red, green. The green circle means that the dog does not show any external signs of that stressor, and that the dog seems perfectly normal, perfectly calm. When you go to the orange circle, that means that the agitator has come closer. The dog starts to show signs of stress. That could be a lip lick, that could be panting, that could be a combination of many different signs, and then eventually the dog, like other people would say, will break their threshold and show signs of stress or agitation. For example, excessive barking, growling, lunging, or whatever other behavior the dog might exhibit in relationship to stress. And then eventually we see a green circle very close to the dog, as that in behavior modification, when we deal with reactivity, is our goal, so the dog is not responsive or doesn't show any signs of stress when the adjutant or the stress trigger is close to them. So in dog training, what you see is people talk about lowering the threshold or raising the threshold so the dog can handle more stress. For me, that is a kind of very misleading or faulty explanation of what is going on. So when we deal with stress, then if this red line here is a visual representation of the dog's threshold, then that threshold, anything that is above this line will show signs of visual stress or displayed stress. And this here is actually the amount of or percentage of cortisol. And there's some other stress hormones that are released, but predominantly cortisol will make it easy. It's not completely correct because there's many other hormones that play into effect here, but to make it very simple for this little presentation, we're just gonna call it cortisol. And like with alcohol, at a certain percentage, some dogs are going to respond to a certain stressor. For humans, that is exactly the same. Some humans can deal with a lot more stress than others, but that threshold is basically the same, and that threshold will never change. This line here is fixed. So at a certain percentage of cortisol, your dog or your human is going to show visual signs of stress. What happens with triggers, if we have, for instance, trigger A skateboarder that comes by, the body will respond in producing X amount of cortisol. So let's say 50% of cortisol is released. And if this dog responds to 100% of cortisol, then the dog will not show any visual signs of stress. So when another trigger is released, So for instance, a decoy with a stick or an agitator or a bad guy, maybe 70% of cortisol is released. And again, if this is under the line of 100, no visual signs of stress will appear. And then another dog, for instance, could be 60%. I'll show it a little bit higher. 60%. And again, if that trigger is by itself, then there is no visual sign of stress. However, triggers can stack, and that has something to do with the half-lives of cortisol. So half-life of cortisol. And basically what a half-life of cortisol means is that after a specific amount of time, the amount of cortisol that is still in the body is halved, so 50%. In dogs, that is depending on the dog, between 4 and 6 hours, which is a long time. So if I would say I have trigger A here at 12 in the afternoon, at 1600, there's still 25% of trigger A left. So the dog still has residual stress in his body. So if at 1600 trigger B would occur, then we are very close here to our 100% because this is 75. And now we are hitting the 100% mark. And so now trigger B actually shows visual signs of stress, so the dog will show external stress. And in many other many other trainers will call that trigger stacking. But the scientific explanation from it is that we are actually dealing with residual cortisol and other hormones that are still in the body, and therefore that trigger, when stacked on top of that residual cortisol, will trigger or show signs of external stress. And yes, there is, of course, trigger stacking. If two of these incidents would appear at the same time, the dog will get over threshold. Yeah, and the dog, so for instance, if A would appear again normally together with C, at the same time, then we have also 110% of cortisol release where the dog shows visual signs of stress. So in our training, what our goal is when we are training the dog to desensitize, quote unquote, on these triggers, or to have a dog deal better with these triggers, is we are not going to lower this bar. That is absolutely faulty. So what we're basically doing is that with training and with exposure, and it's the same with humans, think about soldiers, is we're going to reduce the amount of cortisol that is actually released. So after training, after exposure, maybe the skateboarder here only releases 20% of stress, and after more and more training, eventually that will be even lower. So with training, what is not being changed is the threshold itself, but is the amount of stress that is caused, or the amount of stress hormone that is released by a certain trigger. And that is very useful information when we, for instance, deal with dog reactivity. And so what I want to do now is going to show you by a drawing what's going to happen in our next training session. So we're going to take two dogs that have some dog reactivity issues, and then we are going to work with them and kind of figure out where their threshold is. So let me turn this board around here. So when it comes to dog reactivity training, one of the things that I like to do is, if I have my handler here with dog number A, that is, say, the dog reactive dog, then I'm going to put my good dog here with a dog that is dog B, that is completely neutral, and I'm going to place these kind of a big distance from each other. And so what I'm going to see is I'm going to measure the distance between these two dogs, and then observe when I see behavioral changes in dog number A. That could be, you know, the little ears that go back. It could be tail movements. It can be the paws that get closer together. We can see the body stiffen up. We can see the neck stiffen up. But we are going to pay very close attention to this dog's body language and see what he does. And then eventually, we are going to give the dogs two choices here. So I'm going to work with the dog, for instance, with food, which is a primary reinforcer. We don't need to teach the dog to work for food. And so in the beginning, what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep the dogs in the neutral zone. So I want the dog, with this dog that is right here, I want to place this dog in such a distance that he does not respond, and I'm going to give him the chance of eating his breakfast or dinner, or, you know, this working for some reward. And then slowly but surely, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the dog reactive dog a little bit closer and measure this again. And then I'm going to give the dog two choices: is either go be reactive, or, and reactive means I don't want the dog in full unwanted behavior. I want to stay where I see subtle signs. If you bring the dog where he's completely lunging and reacting, you push the dog too far. So that gives you, if you bring this dog over this line and you see all this, I'll do it in red here, you see all this external behavior with a lot of intensity, you pushed this boundary too far. You kind of need to stay in the orange line. And in the orange line, where the dog is slightly stressed and shows little signs of stress, like the licking, the stiffness of the body and set, but not the whole lunging, this is the area where you want to work. And this is where you want to give the dog a chance. So any movement from this dog, from dog number A towards the dog, is kind of perceived as pressure. Yeah, so this is pressure, this is added stress. Any movement from the neutral dog towards our reactive dog is also perceived as pressure from our dog reactive dog. So we need to be very careful that once we find our orange zone where we want to do our desensitization work or our behavior modification work, is that we stay on one neutral line, is that we do not go towards or away from the dog. If I would go the opposite direction, if I would take my neutral dog away from the dog, or I put my dog reactive dog away, this is going to be perceived kind of as a, you know, de-stressor or win. Yeah, or, you know, in case of severe stress, this could also lead to avoidance. Maybe the dog reactive dog is avoiding the situation by increasing his distance from the stressor. So in this work, what's really important is that we keep that dog in this kind of orange line where we can getting more comfortable, and eventually by exposure the amount of perceived stress will decrease. So we could eventually, let me turn the board around here again. We could, of course, also do this in a circle. We could put our decoy dog, our neutral dog, in the middle, and we could make a big circle with our dog that has dog reactivity issues. And if we walk in the same distance around that dog, if we do not increase or decrease this distance from the circle, we are also walking and working in a very neutral way. So the nice thing about working in a circle is that you can actually place multiple decoy dogs eventually. So rather than increasing the stressor, with shortening the distance, we can increase the stressor with adding a dog at the same distance, and then observe our dog that is walking around. So we'll put two neutral dogs here, and then see how this guy responds to two neutral dogs. Vice versa works too. If you put the dog reactive dog here and now you put neutral dogs around him, that is also a way that we could work with desensitization. However, the biggest difference is that the distance is going to play a little bit lesser of a role, because as soon as we add more dogs at the same distance, the dog can perceive that as a lot higher stress or get more stress. So we do need to pay attention to the subtle signs, the subtle body language, because there's a big chance that if we add two dogs, that this dog, although the distance is the same, will go into my orange line. So like there's some people out there and who call it BAT training, behavioral adjustment training. But everybody talks about thresholds and lowering and raising the threshold, which I don't agree with it. If you look at what happens inside the body of the dog and how the the hormonal changes play a role. So there is something that we call trigger stacking or cortisol stacking, but again, many other hormones play a role.